Welcome to the Xeno Podcast, where we talk about stories and how they shape us and how we shape them. Today I'm here with my co-host Jackson and Dr. Plicka.
Dr. Plicka is our creative writing professor. Carly and I have taken a bunch of classes from Plicka, so we thought he'd be great for this. And today we're going to be talking about a little bit about creativity and research and how some people find that those are mutually exclusive, but they are not actually. How are you doing today?
Wonderful, Jackson. Thank you for letting me be here.
No, it's great to have you. So, this idea of this podcast came from our little chat. So, creativity and research. A lot of people think that research is very scientific, can't be like mingled with creativity, but you have experience with creativity and research.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to introduce myself? Should I do that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about
Just
yourself.
for the audience at home, for the huge audience at home,
All our
just
listeners.
remind them. Yeah, I've been teaching here for 5 years, and mostly the creative writing classes, which are where I've met you two aspiring podcasters,
Yes.
and we, and so you've heard a lot of my shtick and my spiel, but I did 6 years in Ohio at a PhD program there in creative writing, and
Are you joking me right now?
creative writing and literature, and focused on fiction. So that was my dissertation. Wrote a collection of short fiction, which I was just looking over before I came here, just to remember when I used to kind of have time to be smart and do other things besides teach. And talked and wrote a lot about fiction and the elasticity of language and kind of the way that it allows us to enter into worlds in a way that other genres can't. So anyways, so I've been teaching here for 5 years. I've got 3 kids, a beautiful wife who teaches here.
Really painting a picture.
Painting a
Yeah.
picture.
You're
you are.
5'11", 6'1".
5'11" is probably 6 foot is what I used to say, but if I'm honest, 5'11". Yeah.
He's wearing a
Short day.
gray paisley shirt.
Yep.
It's very cool.
Thank you.
And some nice jeans.
Oh,
And I don't know what type of shoes are. Are those Sanooks?
these are Sanooks
Ooh.
or Sanooks,
I don't know.
whatever.
Those are super comfortable.
Oh man, so
Free plug.
so comfortable.
We're not sponsored.
Excellent. Well, okay, so creative writing and research. Okay,
Yeah.
cut me off
Yes.
at any time. Ask questions.
Okay.
But because I had to think about this a little bit. Okay, so the premise is, as Jackson mentioned, there's creative endeavor and there's scholarly endeavor. And at a university, those two things are kind of have this awkward side-by-side relationship. You have people at the university who are painting and making music and writing and stuff, and then, of course, people who are doing empirical research and original scholarship in the humanities, interpretation and explication. And so those two things kind of get separated out. And when people say research, they usually mean something very serious. And when people say creative, they mean something, I don't know, fun and fluffy and kind of flighty. But this was an interesting topic when you proposed it. So I've thought a little bit more about it. And the kind of research that you engage in as a creative person, and particularly as a writer of imaginative literature, poetry, creative nonfiction, fiction, is can be looked at in a couple of ways. So, first of all, where do stories come from is like a concept that if you go to any poetry reading, fiction reader, essay writer, and you go to a reading, someone in the audience, well-meaning person, always asks, and it's kind of an inside joke among writers because it's like that someone's going to ask this question, and it's not a bad question, but the question is, where do you get your ideas? Where do you get your ideas for your whatever you're writing? And so I've heard a lot of people answer that question, and most of the time they're kind of at a loss. Like, there's this kind of half answer. They just are. It's hard. And part of it is that writers are kind of, they want to hide the fact that what they do is maybe a little bit ordinary, make it seem more mysterious. Like, there's the whole prophet artist kind of idea, which is, I think, still the way that we look at our favorite artists, is that we put them up on a pedestal and realize, forget that they are in many ways just like us, But they're different because they come up with these beautiful works of art that we love so much, and so we just assume that they are these angelic beings who kind of have communication with the muse, and that they're getting this constant stream of revelation, of artistic revelation. But the fact is that where does literature come from? It's probably a lot more boring and ordinary than we make it out to be. So
a lot of elbow grease.
A lot of elbow grease. That's
research.
Research.
Empirical
Okay,
data.
that's okay. Thank you for bringing it back, Carly.
Bringing it back around.
I absolutely appreciate
That's
that.
why I'm here.
It's not just tapping into the ether.
It's not. I mean, it is and it's
It
not.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but there's two sides of it, and what we're talking about is that other side, because everyone knows that inspiration strikes, and people write things down on napkins, and they have revelations on trains, like J.K. Rowling did when she
Bless her.
she
for
claimed
that.
when she claimed really, when you hear her talk about it, the language she uses is almost religious when she talks about how Harry came to her more or less as a fully formed character in her head, and she just suddenly he was there. And that does happen. But then, of course, she had to write 7 books, and those didn't just come to her on a train unbidden in that way. So what did she do? She sat down and she worked. And at some point when you're working on something, you realize that your brain can only take you so far. And so that's where, quote unquote, how many times have I said quote unquote? Hopefully not too many.
That's
I
only
think
the
it's the
first
first one.
time.
Okay, good.
So
I probably overused that.
we'll count it up.
You had a lot of
Tally it.
worries today.
I do, yeah.
Worried about the.
I'm a very anxious person.
It's okay. You're doing great.
If that comes
fine.
out, hopefully. But yeah, the what was the quote unquote?
It was
We're
about
talking
J.K.
about-
Rowling
yeah.
and like the ether.
Dang it.
Coming
Okay.
From the ether.
So she has to write 7 books, and she's comes to a point, okay, where the river runs dry, right? Where your brain, your ideas take you only so far, or you have something and you realize that there are a lot of things in there that are, depending on what you're writing, checkable facts. I mean, things that people could, if they wanted to, go and check. Like, is that true? Is that real? Even in fiction, in much literary fiction that is quote unquote realistic fiction, there are checkable facts about places, people, things, processes, the natural world. So I'll give you a couple examples from my own work, and not that I'm very much still an aspiring writer, but I've done some things. So I wrote a story about. Paraphrasing stories is the worst. They always sound super boring, and it probably is. But it's about a guy, like a washed-up basketball player, who's past his prime. He was a star in college. He's had some failed. I mean, he's well off. He runs a business, but he's had some failed political race bids to like state senate or whatever. And so he's kind of this larger-than-life character, but he hasn't quite reached that pinnacle that he had maybe hoped that he would reach when he was a college basketball star. And he didn't make it to the NBA because he got injured. Anyways, so this is a guy, he's kind of approaching the end of his life. And the story is kind of about his acceptance of life. And part of it is that he starts taking in foster dogs. That's very exciting, I know. And he takes in these foster dogs who are all like bad dogs. I mean, they're just, his wife hates it because his dogs are always chewing things up. But he's somehow decided that this is his mission in life now, is to do these dogs. And he's got this friend who is a boxer, or who loves boxing. Mm-hmm. And part of the ritual with his friend is they watch boxing together. So of course I loved all this as I was writing it, and thought, oh, this is fun. And I love the dialogue and the interaction. But there came a time where I needed to go learn more about boxing. And it sounds so straightforward and obvious, like, well, duh. Like, you just get on the internet and you, but people who read that story, hopefully they don't think about the fact that, oh, there was a guy doing hours and hours of research into boxing in order to write this, because it kind of spoils the magic of it a little bit. But I was. Part of it is that you get sucked down the rabbit hole when you get on the internet. Yeah. I was actually reading a writer, or an article in Writer's Digest or something, about a guy saying, he said, I think the internet is, for many obvious reasons, probably a big part of why there are so many writers these days, so many people writing, is because that part of the process is so easy. I mean, the internet is so easy. And you can learn about anything you want, and then you can say interesting things about it. So I wrote about boxing. I had to do research. I wrote about dogs. I actually did research on the Humane Society, SPCA, and how that works. And most 90% of the stuff doesn't end up in your story because you're not writing a report on boxing. You're writing the story where this plays a part, but it has to feel to the reader so seamless and real that they don't notice the research. So one of the pieces of advice that writers give, like Janet Burraway, who wrote the textbook that I use in 218, is you want to read not necessarily about the period that you're writing, and she's talking specifically about historical fiction, but not just about it, but mostly in it, like reading letters and journals and books that were written during that time, and newspapers and stuff like that, so that you're absorbing like the feelings and the cadences of speech and language and the culture of that time, and not just the information about that time. Because what happens sometimes is when writers get overzealous in their research and get excited about all the things that they're learning and how they could be incorporated into their work, into their stories or whatever, is you get this almost kind of encyclopedic tone that comes in, and it's the fingerprint.
It's like Moby Dick.
Like Moby Dick. Yeah, and see, here's the thing. This is all discussions of writing can be contradicted so easily by just pointing to some great writer and being like, well, he did it.
No, I'm just saying. Like,
no, but it's
his
true.
Feels very encyclopedic. Like, this is how like whaling works, and it just goes into like a lot of the. But then it's like, oh, but also God. Like it ties in everything back to God. But usually,
totally,
this is how a rope works and a pulley. It's just super.
Yeah.
Encyclopedic.
Herman Melville would not have made it through a creative writing class at a college because some professor like me would have been like,
oh,
what? Yeah.
I wrote this thing, but it's garbage.
Yeah, and someone would have been like, dude, this is like, get back to the story, man. Like, we don't want to read 60 pages on whaling, just the facts and the ins and outs about whaling. If you can make it interesting, I guess, maybe, but yeah, nobody can write books that long anymore either, unless you're...
How long is that one?
I
I've
don't
never
even
read
know.
it.
400, 500 pages.
Guys, true confessions, I've never read Moby Dick.
Me neither. So...
I was just assigned it last semester, so...
I said it.
I said it.
I'm a professor of English. I've never read it. Yeah, but,
fine.
I know about it. So, yeah, I mean, you read stuff like that. And other novels, especially... PreTelevision, I've said this before in classes, PreTelevision novels served a different purpose. They were like a big source of entertainment and way of passing the time, whereas today people are just looking for time to read. So 800-page books just don't really fly off the shelves anymore unless you're David Foster Wallace or somebody. But so you have the fingerprint of your research kind of so firmly stamped on a story that it kind of spoils the magic almost a little bit, or it takes the reader out because it seems suddenly like the curtain gets pulled back a little bit and it's the author's like sticking his head out like, see how much I know about boxing? Isn't that cool? By the way. Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, like, what was the final product in your story of boxing? Like, how much did you end up using?
Was it like the lingo or just
much of it was the language, yeah. Okay. The lingo, knowing what kinds of punches, because you think you know about something. Like, oh yeah, boxing. I've seen some boxing matches and boxing. But then you have to write about it and you're like, is it a jab? Is that what they call it? A right hook? And like, am I saying the right thing? So yeah, the lingo was a lot of it. And because it wasn't, I wasn't wanting to get the reader distracted by using real boxers' names or anything like that, because that wasn't important. So I didn't necessarily need to know the facts about names and dates and places. But yeah, just the lingo and the rhythms of the fight. And it was basically one scene. I mean, any amount of research that I did probably amounted to no less than 50 to 100 words in the story, or maybe more than that. But so that's an example. So one of my favorite novelists, Philip Roth, and one of my favorite books, American Pastoral, which won the Pulitzer Prize, I think, in the 80s, maybe early 90s. So Philip Roth is a genius, but I'm sure when you're reading that book, it's based partly on his personal experiences. I think he grew up in the New Jersey area, and maybe even in Newark. Now I should have done my research before I came and started saying this. Someone go fact check that. And I believe his family was even involved in manufacturing and maybe even glove making. Anyways, in the book, the main character's family is involved in making gloves. and it's a novel, and there are pages and pages, not so much like not like Moby Dick, not to that extreme, but there are pages and pages describing the process of manufacturing gloves, and because he's a genius, he makes it pretty interesting. But clearly, I don't think that was something that Philip Roth just had sitting on the top of his head, like that he could recite and remember all of the details of that, how that's made. And it's not that anyone is necessarily going to fact check all of that and call him out, but they could, and writers do get called out for inconsistencies even in novels. But it's, as a professor of mine used to say in Ohio, it's the getting your moon in the right sky, which was his way of saying, even if it's just a background part of your story, that you're saying the moon was, on this date was full and it was in this part of the sky, and that's a checkable fact that could be wrong. And getting that right maybe somehow magically just lends your story that much more strength and credibility. Essentially, it's a way of it's a technique of helping to suspend that reader's disbelief. Everything you can do to bring them into that imagined, vivid, dreamlike state that is a good piece of fiction. That's what John Gardner says. He says it's the vivid dream of fiction, and you just, as a writer, you're doing anything you can to keep that dream from being interrupted or being woken up. So I don't know. I guess the takeaway is that for young writers, and I teach a lot of young writers in class, and I was the same way as a young writer, right? You just don't realize how much work it actually is. You think that it's just about whether you have the talent or not, and that if you just sit long enough in front of a computer screen, or if you just, if you open yourself up to the gods or whatever, that's all you need is just
the writing gods,
right? And and when you feel that rush of inspiration to get down the first draft or the first part of a piece, you can be deceived into thinking that that's all you need. Oh yeah, this is so good. Like, it feels so natural, it feels so easy. It must be genius. It must be. And then to be the disappointment of knowing that inspiration was important, but really, to use a overworn sports analogy that kind of spoils this whole thing, is who said that it's 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration, or whatever. I think it was
I have no idea.
Vince Lombardi. I'm going to say Vince Lombardi because he's behind all football quotes.
Probably Vince Lombardi
I
said
was going to
so.
go with Babe Ruth, so you just...
He probably said it first.
Yeah.
And Vince Lombardi stole it from him.
So
that's the disappointing part of doing anything creatively, is realizing that the fun initial part at least, is only a very small portion of it, and then the rest of it is hard work, but it is also something that to be a successful artist, you have to grow to love, and you do after a while. After going through the process of research and revision enough times, it's something that you can grow to love. But so I guess what we're really talking about is research as a euphemism for it's hard to write and be
Google
creative.
a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's the takeaway. It's hard.
It's hard.
It's all hard.
Came up with a metaphor in the meantime that you can say next
please.
time you share this with your class. So sometimes a gold nugget will just fall out of the sky, which isn't true, but just pretend.
For sure, yeah, it happens.
But besides that, you gotta just mine away at the ether
Yeah, right.
to get those other gold nuggets and put them together.
Yeah, or as I know, because I grew up in California near Sutter's Fort, where the gold rush started. Sometimes you're just walking across the river and you find a huge chunk of gold, like John Sutter did. Yeah,
Wow.
it's a little research for you.
Whoa.
But most of the time you have to pan through sand for like 12 years to get that much gold. That's why a lot of people don't do it. Well, yeah, it's why a lot of people don't end up writing and painting and doing those things.
Yeah, it's like, that's everything, Everybody's like, oh, it comes so easy. Everybody's looking for a quick fix. It's like, I just can't tap into the ether. But
yeah.
Love the perspiration. Vince Lombardi.
Love it, yes. Well, yeah, you got to get sweaty and not be afraid of really stinking, because that's how you feel a lot of times when you're in the throes of that kind of work and that kind of research, is you don't know if it's going to pay off. You don't know, again, like how much you're going to use, whether it's going to turn out well. It's this enormous act of faith. It's terribly depressing a lot of times. That's why a lot of artists are kind of grumpy and depressed people. Not all. And it's why I think that's part of the reason why I think I haven't been maybe as successful a writer as I want to be at this point, besides my kids, I'll blame a lot on them, but is because I think I'm just too happy. Like I'm just too pleasant.
You can't scrape the bad out of your consciousness to throw against a canvas that is paper.
Yeah, right. But anyways, I could go on and on about this. Do you guys, would you want to redirect it in some way? Do you have another question about?
No, I was curious about your PhD. So you wrote a collection of stories.
Yeah.
Did you research for that? Like, how did you prepare yourself for that?
Yeah, well, so kind of like I mentioned, I did do a lot of research for if you would do a creative dissertation in a creative writing dissertation, which sounds silly to some people. They do require you to do a kind of a critical introduction. So I wrote like 40 pages of what could be considered like an academic paper that was about fiction and language, whatever.
Was it like a self-analysis?
Partly, which was weird because you're like,
I mean this.
Yes, you're talking about how your own work kind of fits into this paradigm, this theoretical paradigm. I wasn't like interpreting it so much like this is what the story means, but talking about how these concepts, more abstract concepts, maybe influence the way that I work or whatever. And it's a little bit of an exercise. It's when you're actually writing or actually doing any creative thing, you're not usually thinking in those abstract theoretical ways. You're just trying to live in the moment and kind of feel it. But so I had a professor who said you have your two hats. You have your writer hat and you have your scholar theory hat, and then when you're writing, you got to take off the theory hat and put the other one on. Hopefully some of that stuff kind of stays in your brain and bounces around and subconsciously influences what you do and who you are, but you can't overthink it, right? You'll just be paralyzed if you're thinking about that kind of stuff. If you're as a shout out to my brilliant colleague Ned Williams, if you're trying to write a story and you've got Ned Williams in your head, like talking about postmodernism, you might not even be able to, you won't get very far, right? Because it's like, it deconstructs itself. I don't know. They're two separate activities and related, but it's hard to coexist.
So basically, when you use research, it's as like a stepping stone to get to the next pocket of ether, or what? I keep saying ether.
Well said. Oh, I love that. No, that's great. I like that. Stepping stone to the ether. Yeah, it's like
just trying to get there.
Right.
Just step by step.
You need something concrete, to move yourself forward. Absolutely.
Otherwise, it just sounds like Finnegan's Wake.
Sure. Yeah. And as somebody who's never read Finnegan's Wake, I can't pass judgment on it, but it seems.
I haven't read it completely either. I started it and I was like, this is not hardly English. Okay, so basically, this is my understanding of it, but
you probably know as much as I do.
If someone listens to this and they're very big on James Joyce, I don't know.
Joyce scholars,
and plug your ears. Understand. Yeah. It's basically this really loose story, but the way that it's told is completely stream of consciousness. So it starts in the middle of a sentence, and then there's lots of parts that just aren't English. It's just a bunch of letters, like someone just smashed a keyboard. It's very confusing. I
mean, it's partially intelligible, but it's a grand experiment. And James Joyce wrote so many amazing things before that people have to respect it and kind of be like, okay, you were doing something here, and we just don't understand, like Gertrude Stein. But and it is very actually Gertrude Steinian in the way that he makes up it. There's a lot of words that are just nonsense, and it's kind of fun to read out loud.
Yeah, actually. The audiobook is hilarious though, because they had to learn how to pronounce everything.
And is it an Irish accent? Is the person who read it and have an Irish accent?
I don't know.
Because that's
Finnegan.
That would be even better. Yeah. Well, James Joyce was super Irish. Yeah.
The more you know.
Yeah. Okay, so
that was a tangent.
Yeah, that was a tangent. No. Has it been 3 hours yet? What are we done here?
Only 15 minutes.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Cruising.
Well, so here's something to think about, and let me know what you think. So another way of thinking about this idea of research in art and in creativity and writing is the idea that the whole concept of originality has been, again, overblown and maybe fetishized in creative arts. Is the idea that it's about the original genius. It's about the person with the vision, and it's something that can't be taught or worked at. Probably a more accurate way of thinking about most artistic mediums is collage. So, you know, you had to do collage when you were in elementary school, probably.
Yeah, sure. I don't remember, but I'm sure I did.
Well, like, you know, like you had to cut up a magazine.
Yeah.
With pictures.
It's
and
like,
you had to...
I mean,
scrapbooking basically, but just messier.
Yeah, at some point in elementary school, everybody has an assignment, and they're like, "Mom, do we have any extra magazines?" And the mom's like, "Ah, crap," and they're like calling around. It's like, get some old National Geographics and some Sports Illustrateds and
Good housekeeping.
Yeah.
Good housekeeping, and then and then you make a collage around some idea or theme. I mean, so the originality in collage comes from the way that you put it together. It's not that you are the first one to ever imagine a certain thing or image. Okay, this is getting complicated, but you know, like you did.
Like you're not the first person to use a mountain or whatever in a collage. You're not the first person to do a collage.
Sure, right, yeah. But you're the first person to put everything together in that very specific kind of way, and that's so much what creativity is about. It's about putting things together, and that in and of itself is a worthy and very creative and difficult thing, to put it together in a way that makes sense and is beautiful. The form says something meaningful, but yeah, it's not. It's much less about pure inspiration and much more about working with things that are just already around you and floating around. When Lance Larson came last semester, I think you were there, Carly.
Cool. Yeah, I was there.
I don't know if you made it, Jackson. Were you
I
there?
did not.
Yeah,
I had work or
because
something.
you hate poetry, right?
Yeah, I'm a hater. Just kidding.
No, but he said something like that. He said, as I get older and more mature as an artist, I'm less inclined to think about what I'm bringing and more inclined to kind of be more receptive to what's out there and like what comes to me from the outside. And then I'm the medium, the channel.
The flypaper.
The flypaper. Did he say that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great.
I think. Or
I'm
I
sure
just
he
made
did.
that up.
Even better.
Wait, like flypaper that catches flies?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh.
So the ideas and the images are flies, and the artist is the flypaper.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Actually, I wrote a story about flies. Can I tell you about it real quick?
Yes,
Is
absolutely.
it Lord of the Flies too?
No, it's not. It was. So this is something. The other part of research, of course, is research in quotes. That we're making this word mean so many things now. Personal experience for artists, for writers especially. Personal experience is most of the time, even in the most craziest piece of fiction. I think that if you were to do some kind of real Freudian analysis, you could probably show just how autobiographical it is, like in the characters and the scenes, and you can probably find something in that writer's life that is uncannily similar to what they've put there, and they've disguised it in a certain way and cloaked it in language, but it's all autobiography. I've heard somebody say that. Anyways, but that story was one of the funnest stories I've ever written, and I'm so disappointed that it just hasn't materialized yet into, I think, my hope is someday to go back to it and see exactly what it needs to get published. But it was based on an experience my wife and I had when we went to Idaho to work on. I was actually working on my master's thesis at the time, and we had a family member with a cabin up on a river, and we were like, yeah, we'll go up there and I'll work and I'll write and it'll be great and beautiful. And we got up there and there was like a plague of flies. And I'm not even kidding. Like
this is biblical.
There was a biblical plague. There were so many flies. They were just disgusting, and they were all covering the windows. And then I would slap them, and I'd hit like 3 or 4 or 5 flies at the same time, and they'd fall down into the windowsill, and I was vacuuming them out of the track of the window, and there were like fly guts smeared all over the windows. And I went and I hung flypaper all over the house. Like I would just like tack it to the ceiling. And so if you had walked into the cabin, you would have seen like 20 curly strands of flypaper. Just, it looked like a Nightmare on Elm Street kind of thing. It was just all over
covered.
and flies everywhere and stuff. And then anyway, so then I thought this would be fun to write about, and it started out as just kind of a recreation of that event, but then in fictional fashion it turned into this. Anyways, the guy ends up having these, he's in a rage, and he's got a leaf blower out, and like peanut butter is part of it. Anyways, and then and he ends up like contacting this scientist in at the university down in town, and he goes and he finds a type of duck that's like well known for eating flies, and I think I'm remembering this all correctly. Anyways, the story culminates in his mad like feverish attempt to like kidnap all these ducks from a farm and put them in his trunk and then drive them to the cabin and like let them out in the cabin. Anyways, so that was based on personal experiences, but then becomes much more dramatic, as fiction is. It's a dramatization and an over dramatization, I think, of our ordinary lives. But that's why we like it so much, because it takes all the exciting parts of life and smushes them together. Somebody somewhere has, and spiders. He also collects spiders and tries to put those around the house to take care of the flies. He thinks somehow this natural plague needs a natural cure. Anyways, that wasn't as exciting as I thought. So
no, it was awesome.
Exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. So collage. So research is, you think of yourself as an artist. I think it frees you up actually to be a better writer when you think of yourself not just as this original genius, but as a collector, as a collage maker and a collector of interesting things and images and words and ideas and putting them together. And research plays a big role in that. You have to just be, the other part of research, extending the word even farther, is artist has to be in touch not just with their discipline or their specialty, but with life. And a lot of writers wear this as a badge of pride. Actually, when you read bios, oftentimes you'll see the writer bio that says before he started publishing stories in Harper's, John Smith was a bricklayer, trash compactor, button sewer, karate tutor, list all the odd jobs that they've had. And that somehow is almost like a credential in and of itself, maybe even a more valuable credential than an academic one, to say, basically, to signal to people, like, I have lived life. I have lived a life, and now I'm turning it into art.
Person.
Yes, exactly. This is a real person. But, the parody aside, that is a true thing. Like, there's nothing that every once in a while I'll encounter, and this is going to feel a little mean-spirited, so I'm not talking about anyone in particular, certainly not you two, but sometimes I encounter a student who has these strong desires to write or to be an artist, and they're just not at all a curious person. And it's fine, like, we all can't be this way, but in some ways they're very content with just their little narrow slice of what they know and do, and in that sense are maybe a little bit dull, and it's just not, like, curiosity is the thing I think that drives creativity. And so if I meet someone who wants to be a writer and they're just not ravenously devouring every experience, and especially every book and piece of writing, not just books. I mean, I read a lot of magazines and newspapers, and like I'll go to the doctor's office and I'll pick up like a stupid like a catalog for tourists. Like in Hawaii, they have those like Hawaii things to do in Hawaii. Like, it's the stupidest thing, but I have to be reading something if I'm just sitting there. Unless my children need me to love them and pay attention to them. Like I just have to be reading something. And that's not to say this is why I do what I do, because I still have a long ways to go. But yeah, that curiosity of just knowing what's out there. And not just like knowledge, like I need information, but what do other people in this world think about and feel? And how do other people experience the world? Because it is, in the end, a huge exercise in empathy and in imagination, and imagining what it's like to be somebody else, and imagining what other people might find interesting about being you. Most of the time we just show our boring selves to the world because we're afraid, and also we're polite. And when you're a socially polite person, you don't just put your weirdness out there all the time. But in writing, what people really want is the weirdness. They want to know what's inside this person who talks like everybody else, dresses like everybody else, and mostly acts and behaves like everybody else, because most of us are very conformist in that way. But what's underneath that person, and that rawness is really what appeals to us about writing, is we get to kind of sit in somebody else's brain and feel what they feel in a very intimate way, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, or poetry or something else. But so I don't know. I've thought about using this thing in class that's called, do you know the Great Courses? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
It's like this independent educational, essentially they'll pay professors from all around, people who are top in their field, and they'll say, create a course on this topic and a series of lectures, and we'll record them, audio and DVD, and then we'll write them up. And they probably, I don't know how much they get paid for that, but then those courses are packaged and sold, not as part of a university curriculum, but just anyone can buy them. So like a lot of retired people buy them, like my grandparents, my grandpa buys a lot of them because he has time and he's a smart guy and he's wants to be learning. And so he buys stuff like courses on physics and stuff about biology, and he's interested. Anything you're interested in, you can find. There's a couple companies that do it, I think. So they're great courses. I get emails from them. And they have a course called Daily Life in Ancient Times or something along those lines. And all the lectures are like, what was it like to be a peasant in Rome? What was it like to be a slave in Egypt? What was it like to, and they really try to recreate in some kind of historical way, and obviously there is some imagination involved, recreate what it was like to be not just the king or the ruler, people we usually hear about in history, but to be the ordinary person. What was their daily life like? What did they wear? What did they eat? Where did they go? How did they spend their time during the day?
The trash collectors.
The
Karate tutors.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that seems to me like, I don't know, I've thought about making that a part of the curriculum in my creative writing course and asking people to write from the perspective of one of those characters, because I think that's kind of what it's about.
It seems
another
like
kind of research.
A lot of this is coming back to just one of the most said statements ever, but it's like, write about what you know, write what you know. And it seems like if you don't know, like if you hit a gap, just like go find out. Like, yeah. But it always comes back to like rawness, like you were saying, like knowing either about yourself or boxing. Yeah. Whatever.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things I wrote on my little 4x6 card that is guiding our discussion today. That exactly, that whole phrase, write what you know, seems to be at odds with the notion of needing to be a curious and person and do research, quote unquote. Because what do we know? I mean, I've lived a little more life than you guys, but not much.
Not twice.
So
yeah, not double.
So,
wife and kids probably like triples it.
Sure,
I feel like you're in charge of other human beings.
You experience some things.
Like the first 4 years of our life, like I don't remember anything. So really, I'm 16.
Sure, yeah, and I'm 21. Yeah, no, but you know things that I don't know, and I know things that you don't know. But write what you know in some ways is terrible advice, right? Mm-hmm. Because then you're in this little box of your own experiences, and what's the use of imaginative literature if that's what you're going to confine yourself to? On the other hand, it's good advice because it's an encouragement for people who feel like, well, I have to be this other person in order to write. I have to be an amazing, educated, world-traveling kind of person, and that's, I think, why that advice exists, because it's saying, no, you don't. You have experiences and an inner life that's worth exploring. But in order to make that inner life interesting, you're going to have to work hard and maybe do some poking around and educate yourself and research. But yeah, write what you know. Maybe that's another way of just summing up this whole idea is.
Well, it's part of it.
How far does that advice take you? Right.
Well, see, let's review the nuggets of wisdom. So we got love the perspiration.
Love it. Yeah. Feel it.
Write what you know. And then also, like, you're saying, like, write what you know, and you're not saying to, like, shy away from the inspiration or the ether. I keep saying that. It's just, like, the best way.
I love the ether. Yeah. It's all, but something I also think of, like, the way that ether is also used as isn't it also the chemical that you use to, like, make people pass out?
I think so.
Yes. No, or is that something else? Chloroform.
That's
sorry.
Maybe
but there is, like, a chemical ether, right?
There is a chemical ether, yeah.
But I'm talking about, like, the aether. Like, it's, like, the God force.
Absolutely. The spirit, so to speak.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. I don't know. Something that Newton probably disproved, like, the ether.
Or thought he disproved.
Yeah. Hey, it's still out there.
We should research that. Write a story about it.
But anyway,
the ether.
It's not about shying away from the ether. It's about using that until the river runs dry and then working through it.
Right.
Elbow grease.
Elbow grease.
Perspiration.
Love it.
Keywords. Buzzwords.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm still, figuring all this stuff out too. And a lot of it is, about bravery and time and resources and how far you're willing to go to to get the story that you're after, whether you're a journalist or a novelist. I mean, it's all about chasing the story. So the internet, I was reading again Burraway talking about this, the 4 main places for writers to go to do this kind of stuff is the internet, the library, I mentioned this already, to move somewhere, to actually go and expand. A lot of writers have done this, and it's amazing. Of course, it takes money, and it takes time, and it takes a mobility, and some guys with 3 kids don't have as much mobility, but and then interviews and going places are kind of similar. But so I tried to do this a little bit a few years ago. When I was here, I didn't have as many responsibilities, and life was a little bit simpler when I first got here, and I got money to go to St. Augustine because my sister lives right next to St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest continually settled city in the United States, on the mainland United States, because Roanoke was first, or maybe it wasn't. Anyways, Spaniards came to St. Augustine in like the early 1500s, and then they left and came back and built a fort there later. Anyways, it's a fascinating city. It's like this interesting blend of amazing historical place and like Disneyland for senior citizens. Like there's all, because it's in Florida and people go vacation there, and there's a lot of kind of cheesy tourist stuff around. Like the original Ripley's Believe It or Not museum is there.
I wonder what the first issue of that was like.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Can you believe how big this cow is?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, it's a crazy place.
Fool's Gold was like the first thing. Like it is not.
Oh, so it's a cool place, and I thought, I had this vision, like I'm gonna go and be in St. Augustine. I've spent time there with my sister, but I was gonna go be there for 2 weeks and just have nothing to do but be there. And I had these romantic visions of what it was gonna be like, and it was wonderful. And I was by myself, which doesn't happen very often after you have a family. And I was taking pictures. I have a ton of pictures still. I filled up a whole notebook. I bought a ton of books. I mean, it was just awesome. It was so fun. But I haven't had the time and the will and the work. Yeah, I had it in me to go and sort through all that stuff. And so I think the other thing, what I'm getting at, is that research can in some ways overwhelm you and overwhelm a project if you part of it is just, I'm not a historical fiction writer, and I'm trying to figure that out. And I don't want to write historical fiction as much as fiction informed by this historical place. But, I have so many books, notes, and pictures now that I'm overwhelmed by the whole thing. And someday, I still feel like maybe this will be my magnum opus in 30 years. That's what I can look back and be most proud of, is my book on St. Augustine. But, so moving somewhere and soaking it in and being there certainly is there's no substitute for actually being there. The internet can only take you so far, and that's kind of the exciting part about writing, is that it's the experience is as much a part of the process as the intellectual exercise. So anyways, we were about to end, and then I pushed it too far. I'm having such a good time.
No, it's good.
We can do part 2
like
if you
20
want.
minutes, so.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
It's been awesome.
You guys gonna take some more classes from me?
I don't know.
If
I
you
think
have any more,
we're out of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you both ran through the whole gamut, didn't you?
I did all the creative writing, all the Kulamanu.
Kulamanu.
Submit this semester.
Hey,
by the way, plug for Kulamanu.
Oh.
It is BYU Hawaii's magazine of art and literature.
Absolutely.
You can submit, and Joe Plicka.
Deadline March
Dr.
10th.
Plicka.
Yeah.
March 10th.
Just, get on Facebook and type in Kulamanu Journal. You'll find it.
That's KULA space MANU.
Thank you.
Kulamanu.
Cool.
Yeah. It's great. Last year's issue, I think, was
the best.
It was a highlight. Yeah, no,
that was because Carly and I were on the editing staff.
Yeah,
we were.
Exactly. No,
it was fun.
I'm not just blowing smoke here. I think you guys, like, when I look at all the issues, and I've had a couple people actually say to me even, last year's was the best. I don't know, like, if they've read all of the previous ones, but
for sure,
the best one that they remember.
Yeah. So.
Oh, that's good. It was a good one.
Made us
Put our
proud.
heart and soul into it.
We did.
Yeah, you did. You had to do a little
fun.
research too.
Yeah.
That's true.
We researched literary magazines.
Yeah.
So that was fun.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Thank you.
This has been the Xeno Podcast. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Xeno Podcast. That's Xeno Podcast. And you can also email us if you have any questions about creativity and research or anything that we talked about, or suggestions for future episodes at podcastzeno@gmail.com.
Yes. And this podcast was brought to you by the BYU Hawaii's Reading and Writing Center. Thanks for learning by listening.